Mira Voss had exactly 4 candles left in her workshop, and she was burning through them faster than she could afford to replace. It was past midnight when she heard the knock. Not loud, just one knock. Careful, like whoever was outside didn't want to wake the whole street. She almost didn't answer. Living alone in the back room of a tailor shop taught you to be careful about who you let in after dark. But the rent was due in 6 days, and she hadn't turned away work in 2 years, and she wasn't about to start now. When she opened the door, there was no one there. Just a box, wrapped in plain cloth, sitting on the whetstone step like it had been left by someone in a hurry. Inside was a cloak. Mira lifted it out carefully, and even in the dim light of her one working candle, she could tell this wasn't ordinary fabric. It was heavier than it should have been, almost like it remembered the weight of something. The color kept shifting black, then a deep bruised purple, then black again, depending on how the light hit it. Along the collar, someone had embroidered symbols she didn't recognize, in thread so fine she had to squint to see the stitches. There was a note pinned to the inside lining. Just 3 words, written in ink so dark it looked wet. Mend it. Tonight, no name, no payment mentioned, just an address for delivery, some manor house 2 hours outside town, that she'd heard of, but never had reason to visit. She should have said no. She almost laughed at herself for even considering it mending a stranger's coat in the middle of the night, for no coin discussed and no face to argue with if things went wrong. But there was something about the fabric under her fingers, something that made her chest go tight in a way she couldn't explain. Like touching something old, older than it should be. So she sat down at her table, threaded her needle, and got to work. The tear ran along the left side, near where a heart would sit if the cloak had been worn by something with a heart. It looked less like fabric had ripped, and more like it had been clawed. Mira had mended a lot of things in her life coats torn by farm work, dresses ruined by careless children, curtains eaten through by moths, but she'd never seen a tear quite like this one. The edges didn't fray the way cloth normally frayed. They almost looked burned. She worked slowly, the way her mother taught her before she died, back when Mira was 12, and thought she'd grow up to do something other than mend other people's clothes for coins that barely covered bread. Small, even stitches. Pull the thread through gently so it doesn't pucker the fabric. Never rush a repair, her mother used to say, because rushed work always shows. About 20 minutes in, her needle slipped. It wasn't a bad prick, barely broke the skin, but a single drop of blood fell from her fingertip and landed directly on the torn seam, right where the 2 edges of fabric met. The cloak reacted like it was alive. The threads around the tear pulled tight on their own, like something breathing in sharply. The purple-black color of the fabric deepened, spreading out from where her blood had touched it, and for a second, just a second, Mira swore she heard something. Not a sound exactly. More like a pressure in the air, a hum that lived behind her teeth rather than in her ears. She yanked her hand back, heart slamming. What in the world? She whispered to the empty room. The cloak settled. The strange hum faded. When she looked closely at the tear again, it was gone. Not mended gone, like it had never existed at all. The fabric, seamless and whole. No trace of thread or stitch or blood. Mira sat very still for a long moment, staring at it. She told herself it was exhaustion. She'd been awake since dawn, hemming dresses for a wedding party that wasn't even paying her fairly, and her eyes were probably playing tricks after so many hours of candlelight. That was the only explanation that made any sense. Fabric didn't heal itself. Blood didn't make things whole. But her hands were shaking when she folded the cloak back into its box, and she found herself glancing at the door twice before she managed to fall asleep that night, fully dressed, boots still on, like some part of her expected someone to come looking for what she'd just done. No one came. Not that night. She delivered the cloak herself the next morning, mostly because she didn't trust the delivery boy not to drop it in the mud, and partly because curiosity was eating her alive. The address led her further than she expected, past the edge of town, down a road lined with old trees that blocked out most of the sun, even at midday. The manor itself rose up out of the mist like something from a story her grandmother used to tell to scare children into behaving. Tall black stone, narrow windows, ivy creeping up walls that looked older than the town itself. A servant took the box from her without a word and shut the door before she could even ask about payment. Mira stood there a moment, feeling foolish, cold air pressing against the back of her neck like something was watching from one of those narrow windows. Then, she turned and walked back toward town, telling herself the odd feeling crawling up her spine was just nerves. She didn't know, walking away from that house, that the moment her blood touched that cloak, she had done something no seamstress before her had ever managed to do. She had completed an oath that had been open, bleeding, and unfinished for 600 years. And somewhere behind those narrow windows, a man who hadn't felt his own heartbeat in centuries had just felt it stutter back to life for the first time. The payment came 3 days later, and it was so much money that Mira had to sit down. A man in a plain gray coat, no house colors, no crest, dropped a velvet pouch into her hands and left before she could even ask his name. Inside was more silver than she made in half a year. She counted it twice, sure she'd made some mistake, but the number stayed the same both times. She should have been thrilled. Instead, she felt uneasy, the way you feel when someone gives you something and you don't know what they'll want in return. For a week, nothing happened. She went back to her normal work, hemming, patching, the occasional wedding dress, and slowly let herself believe the whole strange night had just been a fluke, a trick of exhaustion and bad candlelight. She almost convinced herself of it. Then the same servant showed up again. No box this time, just a message. Lord KL requests your presence. Tonight, Mira blinked. Who? The master of the house you delivered the cloak to. The servant said it flatly, like she should already know, like everyone in town whispered his name behind closed doors, even if they never said it out loud in daylight. She had heard of Lord KL, actually not much, just rumors. That he never left his estate during the day, that he hadn't been seen in town for years, that the previous owner of the manor, some cousin or uncle, had vanished under circumstances nobody talked about directly. People said his family had been cursed generations back, though nobody agreed on what the curse actually was. I have work, Mira said, which was true, though it wasn't really why her stomach was twisting. He was very specific, the servant said. Tonight, she went. Of course she went. She told herself it was about making sure she wasn't in some kind of trouble, that a man like that summoning a poor seamstress out of nowhere probably meant something had gone wrong with the cloak, and she needed to protect her reputation before word got around that her work was shoddy. That wasn't really it either. She just needed to know what she'd felt that night. She needed an explanation, even if part of her already suspected the explanation wouldn't be one she liked. The manor looked different at night. Bigger, somehow, like the shadows added extra rooms that didn't exist during the day. A different servant let her in this time, leading her down a long hallway lined with portraits of people whose eyes seemed to follow her a little too closely. She found him in a study at the end of the hall, standing near a fireplace that wasn't lit, his back to her. He was tall. That was the first thing she noticed, even from behind tall in a way that made the room feel smaller. His hair was dark, pulled back loosely, a few strands escaping near his neck. When he turned to face her, Mira's breath caught somewhere in her throat and refused to come back out properly. His eyes weren't like anyone else's she'd seen. Not the color, though the color was strange too. Somewhere between gray and gold depending on the light, but the way he looked at her. Like he was reading something written on her skin that she couldn't see herself. "You're the seamstress," he said. Not a question. "Mira," she said, because it felt wrong not to give her name when he clearly already knew who she was. "Mira," he repeated, slowly, like testing the shape of the word in his mouth. "Do you know what you did to my cloak?" "I mended it," she said, keeping her voice steady, even though her hands wanted to shake. "That's what I was asked to do. You mended it with your blood." Her face went hot. "It was an accident. My needle slipped, that's all. If it caused some kind of problem, I'll return the payment. I don't want the payment back." His voice was quiet, but it filled the room somehow, like it didn't need to be loud to be heard clearly. "I want to know how you did what you did. That cloak has been torn for 600 years. Seamstress, no thread has ever held it. No hand has ever closed that wound, and you did it in one night, without meaning to, without even understanding what it was." Mira stared at him. 600 years, she repeated slowly, like maybe she'd misheard. "You should probably sit down," he said. And for the first time, something in his voice cracked just slightly. Not with anger, but with something that sounded almost like exhaustion. Like a man who had been carrying something heavy for far too long, and had just realized, against every expectation, that someone else might be able to help him carry it. "This is going to take a while to explain, and I doubt you'll believe most of it." She sat. He didn't explain right away. He poured 2 glasses of dark red wine first, handed her one, and didn't touch his own. "My family has been bound by an oath since before either of us was born," he said finally, standing near the cold fireplace again, like he needed the distance. "A blood oath. My ancestor made a bargain a long time ago: power, protection, a kind of life most men don't get to have. In exchange, the bargain demanded something be woven into the fabric of our house. Literally, that cloak isn't just cloth, Mira. It's the physical form of the agreement. As long as it stays whole, the protection holds. The moment it tears, everything the oath protects becomes vulnerable." "And it tore," Mira said slowly. 600 years ago. In a fight my ancestor barely survived. Every seamstress since has tried to mend it. None succeeded. The material doesn't respond to ordinary thread. It only responds to blood freely given. Blood offered without knowing what it means. Blood from someone with no stake in the outcome." He looked at her directly then, and something in his expression made her stomach flip in a way she didn't fully understand. "That's very rare, Mira. Most people who touch that cloak know exactly what they're touching. You didn't. So I fixed it," she said. "That's good, isn't it? Shouldn't you be relieved?" "I should be." He didn't sound relieved. He sounded almost wary. But an oath like that doesn't just get repaired for free. It takes something in return, and I don't yet know what it took from you. Mira frowned, glancing down at her own hands like she expected to see some visible sign of whatever he meant. "I feel fine. You feel fine tonight," he said. "Give it time." There was a long silence after that. Mira drank some of the wine because her mouth had gone dry, and it was better than nothing, even though her mind was racing through everything he'd just told her, trying to make it fit into a world she understood. Blood oaths. Bargains that lasted centuries. A man standing in front of her, who apparently hadn't aged since whenever this whole mess began. "What are you?" she finally asked, because there was no polite way to work up to it. He almost smiled. "Almost, you already suspect. I want to hear you say it." "Vampire," he said simply, like the word cost him something to admit out loud, even after however many centuries he must have had to get used to it. "King of a line that's outlived every kingdom that ever tried to hunt us down. Cale Ashworth, if titles matter to you. though I doubt they will once you understand what being near me actually means. Mira should have run. Later, thinking back on that night, she would wonder why some part of her sat still in that chair instead of bolting for the door the way any sensible person would have. But there was something in the way he said it, some tiredness underneath the danger, that made her stay instead of flee. "Why tell me all this?" she asked. "You could have just paid me and let me go on thinking it was a strange coincidence." "Because the oath doesn't work that way," he said. "Whatever it took from you when you closed that wound, it's tied to me now, whether either of us wants that or not, and I'd rather you understand what you're part of than stumble into it blind." "Part of," Mira repeated carefully. "What does that mean exactly?" He was quiet for a moment too long before answering, and that silence told her more than his words eventually did. "It means," he said slowly, "that as of the moment your blood closed that tear, you became bound to this house the same way I am. Not by choice, not by anything either of us asked for, but bound, all the same." Mira set her wine glass down carefully, because her hand had started to shake, and she didn't want him to notice. "That's not possible," she said, though her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. "I wish it wasn't," he said. And for the first time since she'd walked into that room, he looked less like a king and more like a man who had just realized his life had changed in a way he couldn't undo, and didn't fully know yet whether that was a disaster or the first good thing that had happened to him in 600 years. Mira didn't sleep at all that night. She walked home in the dark, her mind spinning through everything he'd said, trying to find some version of it that made sense in a way that didn't require believing in blood oaths and immortal men bound to cursed fabric. By the time she reached her little room above the tailor's shop, she'd almost managed to convince herself the whole conversation had been some elaborate trick, or maybe she'd simply misunderstood him. Then, she noticed the mark. It was faint, barely visible, curling along the inside of her left wrist like a thin line of ink under her skin. She hadn't had it that morning. She was certain of that. She scrubbed at it with a wet cloth until her skin turned red and raw, but it didn't fade. If anything, the more she touched it, the warmer it felt, like something responding to her attention. "This isn't real," she whispered to the empty room, the same way she had whispered it 3 days before, standing over the cloak that healed itself in front of her eyes. But saying it out loud didn't make it any less true. She didn't go back to the manor. Not for a week. She told herself she was too busy, that the wedding orders were piling up, that a man like Cale Ashworth had no business intruding on the life of an ordinary seamstress, no matter what strange thread now connected them. She kept working, kept her head down, kept telling herself that whatever the mark meant, it would fade in time the way bruises fade. It didn't fade, and on the 8th night, someone came for her. Not Cale. Someone else, a stranger with pale eyes and a smile that didn't reach them, who cornered her in the alley behind the tailor shop just as she was locking up for the night. "You're the one who fixed the cloak," he said, and it wasn't a question, and it wasn't friendly either. Mira's hand went instinctively to the small knife she kept tucked into her apron for cutting thread, useless as it probably was against whatever this man actually was. "Who's asking?" "Someone who's been waiting 600 years for that oath to stay broken," he said, stepping closer. "You've made a very inconvenient mistake, seamstress. Lord Cale's protection was supposed to end with that tear. His enemies were supposed to finally be able to reach him. And now, because of one clumsy stitch, that window's closing." Mira's back hit the brick wall of the alley before she even realized she'd been backing away. "I didn't know what I was doing," she said, voice shaking despite herself. "Doesn't matter." His eyes flicked to the mark on her wrist, visible now that her sleeve had ridden up. "You're tied to him now." "Which means you're tied to everyone who wants him dead too. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked." She didn't remember exactly what happened next, only that 1 second the stranger was reaching for her, fingers cold even before they touched her skin, and the next second he was gone, thrown backward into the far wall of the alley so hard that the brick cracked under the impact. Kyle stood between her and the stranger, his back to her, shoulders set in a way that made him look less like the tired man from the study, and more like something ancient and dangerous that had just remembered exactly what it was capable of. "You shouldn't have come near her," Kyle said, and his voice had dropped into something low and cold that made the hair on Mira's arms stand up, even though it wasn't aimed at her. The stranger scrambled to his feet, wiping blood from his mouth. "The Cartwright line has been waiting centuries for a chance like this, Kyle. You really think one seamstress with clumsy hands is going to stop what's coming?" "I think," Kyle said, taking one slow step forward, "that you're going to leave, and you're going to tell whoever sent you that the oath has already been renewed, which means everything it protected is protected again, including her." The stranger's eyes flicked to Mira, something calculating passing behind them before he turned and disappeared into the dark at the end of the alley, moving faster than anything human should move. Mira realized she was shaking only once the danger had actually passed. Kyle turned to face her, and whatever cold authority had been in his voice a moment ago was gone, replaced by something almost gentle. "I should have told you it wasn't safe to be alone," he said. "I'm sorry. I didn't think anyone would move this quickly." "Who was that?" Mira managed, still pressed against the wall like her legs hadn't quite decided to trust themselves yet. "An old enemy of my family," Kyle said. "There are people who have spent centuries waiting for that oath to fail. Now that you've fixed it, they know their chance is gone. Which makes you a target, Mira, whether either of us wanted that or not." He walked her back to her room that night, staying just close enough that she could feel the strange chill radiating off him, even through her coat, but never quite touching her. "You can't stay here alone anymore," he said, once they reached her door. "Not until I understand exactly what the Cartwrights are planning." Mira crossed her arms, mostly to hide the fact that her hands were still trembling. "I have a life here, a shop. People who expect their orders finished. I'm not asking you to give any of that up." His voice was steady, patient in a way that surprised her, given everything he clearly carried underneath it. "I'm asking you to let me protect you while I figure out how deep this threat actually runs. That's all. And if I say no?" Something flickered across his face, not anger, more like resignation, like he'd expected her to push back and had already prepared himself for it. "Then I'll station guards outside your shop without your permission, and you'll be furious with me, and I'll deserve it. But I won't leave you exposed either way." Despite everything, despite the fear still sitting heavy in her chest from the alley, Mira almost laughed. "That's not much of a choice." "No," he admitted. "It isn't. I'm sorry for that too." She let him walk her inside that night, mostly because her legs were still unsteady, and she didn't trust herself to argue properly. He didn't come further than the doorway, didn't ask for anything, just made sure the windows were latched and the door was solid before he said goodnight, and disappeared into the dark the way he seemed to do so easily. Over the following days, Mira found herself watching the street differently. Every stranger who lingered too long near her shop window made her chest go tight. Every shadow that moved wrong sent her hand toward the little knife in her apron, useless as it probably was. Kael visited most evenings after that, always briefly, always with some excuse checking on her, bringing news about the Cartwrights, once simply showing up with a small parcel of thread and fabric, he said, reminded him of something she might like to work with. He never stayed long. He never pushed. But Mira noticed she started listening for his particular knock, quiet and careful, the same way it had been that very first night with the cloak. "You don't have to keep checking on me every day," she told him, one evening about 2 weeks in, as he stood in her doorway the way he always did, like he still wasn't sure he was welcome to come further inside. "I know," he said. "Then why do you?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at her in that way that made her feel like he was reading something she hadn't said out loud. "Because it's the first time in longer than I can properly remember that checking on someone felt like something I wanted to do, rather than something duty required of me." Mira didn't have a response for that. She busied herself with a bolt of fabric on her table instead, feeling her face heat in a way that had nothing to do with the cold outside. "The mark on your wrist," Kale said, after a moment. "Does it still hurt?" "It doesn't hurt," she said. "It's just there. Warm sometimes," especially she stopped herself before finishing the sentence. "Especially when I'm near," Kyle finished for her. Quiet, like he already knew the answer before she said it. Mira looked up at him. "How did you know that?" "Because mine does the same thing," he said, and pulled back his sleeve just enough to show her a matching mark curling along his own wrist, one she was certain hadn't been there before that night in the alley. "The oath doesn't just bind the estate anymore, Mira. It bound us. Whatever that means, however it plays out, we're tied together now. I don't fully understand the shape of it yet, but I feel it. Same as you do." Mira stared at the mark on his wrist, then at her own, and felt something shift quietly in her chest, some fear loosening just slightly to make room for something else she didn't quite have a name for yet. "That's a lot to just tell me standing in a doorway," she said finally, because it felt safer to say something light than to sit with the weight of what he'd just admitted. A small, tired smile crossed his face, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "I've had 600 years to learn timing. Seamstress. Apparently none of it stuck. Winter came hard that year, and with it came more trouble than Mira had bargained for." The Cartwright name started showing up in whispers around town. A merchant family, wealthy and well-connected. The kind of people who could ruin a small seamstress's business with a single bad word to the right customer. Mira noticed her orders slowing first, then stopping almost entirely. A woman who'd been a loyal customer for 3 years crossed the street rather than walk past her shop. "They're turning the town against me," Mira said one evening, showing Kyle the ledger where her income had all but disappeared over 2 weeks. Nobody said why. They just stopped coming. Kyle's jaw tightened as he looked over the numbers. The Cartwrights can't touch you directly, not with the oath renewed. So they're trying to starve you out instead. Make your life here impossible so you leave, or so you come running to me for help and expose yourself further. "That's cruel," Mira said, though she wasn't sure why it surprised her at this point. "They've had 600 years to get creative," KL said grimly. She didn't ask him to fix it. She wanted to handle this herself, and something in her tone must have made that clear. Because he didn't offer money or influence the way she half expected him to. Instead, he sat across from her table one night and asked what she actually needed. "Customers who aren't afraid of gossip," Mira said. "People who judge the work, not the rumor." "I know several," KL said slowly. "Not from town society. From further out. People who've done business with my family for generations and don't scare easily." It wasn't charity. Not exactly, he was blunt about that, which she appreciated more than she expected to. He simply mentioned her name to people who already trusted his judgment, and let the quality of her work do the rest. Within a week, 2 new commissions arrived, generous ones, from families whose names carried enough weight that the local gossip mill couldn't touch them. "You didn't have to do that," Mira told him. "I didn't do anything," Kale said. "I mentioned a talented seamstress to people who needed one. What they decided to do with that information was entirely up to them." Mira allowed herself a small laugh at that, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly for the first time in days. "You're surprisingly bad at taking credit for kindness." Kindness isn't something I've had much practice being credited for, he said, and something quieter passed behind his eyes when he said it. Something that made Mira want to ask more, though she didn't push. It was another 2 weeks before she learned why. She found him one evening standing in his own library, staring at an old portrait she hadn't noticed before, a woman with dark hair and sharp eyes, painted in a style clearly centuries old. My sister, Kyle said, before Mira could ask. Eleanor. She was the one who made the original bargain, actually, not me. I was younger. She thought she was protecting our family from the war that was coming for us. She didn't know the cost would fall on everyone who came after her. What happened to her? She died holding the oath together the first time it tore, Kyle said quietly. 600 years ago. The tear you closed, that was her final act. She bled into that cloak, trying to save what was left of us. And it wasn't enough. The wound stayed open ever since. Until you. Mira didn't know what to say to that. She stood beside him instead, looking at the portrait of a woman who'd given everything to protect a family that had outlived her by 6 centuries. I'm sorry, she finally said. That's an enormous weight to carry. It is, Kale said. It has been, for a very long time. He turned to look at her, something raw and open in his expression that she hadn't seen from him before. You didn't just close a tear in fabric, Mira. You finished what she started. You have no idea how long I've waited for someone to do that without even trying, without wanting anything from it. I wasn't trying to save anyone, Mira admitted. I was just mending a coat for coin I desperately needed. I know, Kyle said, and something like wonder crossed his face. That's exactly why it worked. The Cartwrights didn't stay quiet for long. It was a cold night in late winter when Mira woke to the smell of smoke. She bolted upright, heart slamming, and realized the smell wasn't coming from inside her own room, but from downstairs, the tailor shop below, where bolts of fabric and years of careful work were stored. By the time she got downstairs, flames had already caught along one wall, climbing fast through dry cloth and old wood. Mira grabbed the nearest bucket, but it was hopeless almost immediately, the fire spreading faster than she could fight it alone. Get out, a voice shouted from the doorway, and she barely had time to register it was Kyle before he was pulling her back from the flames, out into the freezing night air, just as part of the roof gave way behind them with a groan of collapsing wood. They stood together on the street, watching years of Mira's work burn. Neighbors slowly gathering, some helping with buckets, most just watching, faces lit orange by the fire. This was them, Mira said, voice shaking, though whether from cold or fury she couldn't tell anymore. Yes, Kale said grimly, arm wrapped tightly around her shoulders, holding her steady when her legs threatened to give out. This was them. There wasn't much left to save by morning. The shop was gutted, most of her tools ruined, months of commissioned work turned to ash along with everything else. Mira stood in the wreckage at dawn, sifting through burned fabric with hands that had gone numb sometime during the night, unsure if it was from the cold or from something deeper. I'll rebuild it, Kale said, standing behind her. Whatever you need. Tools, fabric, the shop itself, if that's what you want. That's not the point, Mira said, and her voice cracked in a way she hated. I built this myself. Every bolt of fabric, every customer, every year of work, it was mine. Nobody gave me any of it, and they burned it down in one night because of something I didn't even choose to be part of. Kyle was quiet for a moment. You're right to be angry. I don't want your money, Mira said. I don't want you fixing this for me like it's a debt to settle. I'm not offering it as a debt, Kyle said. I'm offering it because I care what happens to you, and I don't know how else to help right now, and I understand if that's not what you need to hear. Mira turned to look at him properly then, exhaustion and grief and fury all tangled together in her chest. "What I need," she said slowly, "is for this to end, not patched over." "Ended. I didn't ask to be tied to your family's 600-year war, KL, but I'm not going to keep losing pieces of my life to it either." "Then we end it," Kyle said, and something in his voice had shifted steadier now, more certain, like her anger had settled something in him rather than pushed him away. "Properly, not just holding the Cartwrights off season after season. I'll find whatever's left of their claim against my family, and I'll finish this permanently." "How?" "The same way Eleanor started it," Kyle said. "The oath isn't just a shield, Mira. It's a source of power, too, if it's invoked properly. Properly renewed, properly claimed by both people bound to it. I've never had someone to share that claim with before. Not since Eleanor died." Mira's chest tightened at what he was implying. "You mean me?" "I mean you," Kale said quietly. "If you're willing." "I won't ask it of you otherwise. You've already given more to this than you ever agreed to." Mira looked back at the ruins of the only life she'd built for herself, the ash still smoking faintly in the cold morning air, and felt something settle inside her that surprised her with how calm it felt. "Tell me what I'd have to do," she said. The ritual, if that's even the right word for it, wasn't what Mira expected. She'd imagined something dramatic: candles, chanting, blood spilled in some elaborate ceremony. Instead, Kyle led her to the library where Eleanor's portrait hung, and simply handed her a small blade, plain and unremarkable. "It has to be a choice," he said. "That's the entire foundation of the oath. Eleanor's mistake, if you can call it that, was making the bargain out of fear. Fear of losing everything. That's why it cost her life instead of simply protecting it. If we do this out of choice instead, if you choose this, fully, understanding what it means it should hold differently, and if I don't choose it fully?" Mira asked, turning the blade over in her hands. "Then it won't work, and we'll find another way to deal with the Cartwrights," Kyle said. "I won't pretend there's an easy path forward either way, but I won't let you walk into this without knowing exactly what you're risking." Mira thought about the shop, burned to nothing, about the mark on her wrist that had been warm and steady every single day since that first night with the cloak, about the way Kyle had stood between her and danger without hesitation, more than once now, without ever once asking for anything back. "What happens to me? If this works," she asked. "Say it plainly. No metaphors this time." Kyle held her gaze steadily. "You'd be tied to this house permanently. Not as a servant, not as property, as an equal claimant to the oath's protection. It would likely extend your years beyond what's natural, though I don't know by how much, and it would make you a target the Cartwrights would never stop pursuing, because as long as you live, their claim against my family dies with you standing in the way. That's not exactly reassuring. I told you I wouldn't pretend it was easy." Mira looked at the blade in her hand, then at him, standing there with all his centuries of weight and grief and quiet, careful patience. A man who'd never once, in all these weeks, tried to make her decision for her. "Ask me properly," she said. "Not the oath. You, ask me what you actually want." Something shifted in KL's expression, something raw breaking through the composed exterior he usually kept so carefully in place. "I don't want you bound to me because a curse demands it," he said quietly. "I want you here because 600 years of my life meant very little until a seamstress accidentally bled onto a torn cloak and gave me back something I thought I'd lost the capacity to feel. I want you to choose this because you want to stand beside me, not because the oath requires a body to fill Eleanor's place." Mira's breath caught. "That's a lot, Kyle, I know," he said. "I've had a long time to think about how to say it properly, and I still don't think I managed it well." She almost laughed, despite everything, despite the exhaustion and grief and fear still tangled together in her chest. You did fine, she said, for someone who's apparently terrible at timing. She pressed the blade lightly against her palm before he could stop her, drawing a thin line of blood, and reached for his hand. I choose this, she said, voice steady even though her heart was hammering. Not because of the mark. Because of you. The moment their blood mingled, the room seemed to hold its breath. The portrait of Eleanor on the wall caught the firelight strangely, almost like the woman in the painting was finally, after 600 years, allowed to rest. The mark on Mira's wrist flared warm, then settled into something steady and permanent, and she felt it not painful, just present, like a heartbeat she hadn't known was missing until it finally synced with her own. Kyle exhaled slowly, something in his shoulders loosening that had probably been tense for centuries. It's done, he said. The oath is fully renewed. Properly, this time. Chosen, not forced. Good, Mira said, though her legs had gone slightly unsteady, the weight of what she'd just agreed to finally settling in. Now let's go make sure the Cartwrights understand exactly what that means. The Cartwrights weren't hard to find. They'd never bothered hiding, confident that centuries of careful legal maneuvering and old grudges gave them all the protection they needed. Their patriarch, a sharp-eyed man named Edmund Cartwright, received them in his own estate with the kind of smug hospitality that made Mira's skin crawl. Lord Kale, Edmund said, rising from his chair with exaggerated politeness. And the seamstress. I'd heard rumors you'd renewed the oath, but I confess I didn't believe a common tradeswoman could manage what generations of specialists failed to achieve. The oath doesn't care about titles, Edmund, Kale said evenly. It never did. That's precisely why your family has spent 6 centuries trying to break it, instead of simply accepting that it works exactly the way it was designed to. Edmund's smile thinned. Careful, Kale. I've entertained your family's arrogance for generations, because it amused me. That patience has limits. Then, let's discuss limits properly, Kale said, stepping forward, and something in his voice made the temperature in the room feel like it dropped several degrees. You burned down an innocent woman's shop. You've spent weeks trying to starve her out of her livelihood through gossip and intimidation. That ends tonight. Innocent, Edmund repeated, glancing at Mira with something between amusement and disdain. She bound herself to a monster willingly, Kyle. I'd hardly call that innocence. Mira felt heat rise in her chest, fury cutting through the fear that had been sitting there for weeks. I bound myself to someone who's protected me more in 2 months than this town has in my entire life, she said, voice steadier than she expected. You burned my shop because you were scared a common seamstress managed something your family's specialists couldn't. That's not power, Edmund. That's just cruelty dressed up in old grudges. Something flickered in Edmund's expression, not quite respect, but something close to it, grudging and surprised. You have spirit, he admitted. I'll grant you that much. I have proof, Mira said, pulling a folded paper from her coat, documents she and KL had spent the last several days gathering quietly records of the fire, witness statements from neighbors who'd seen Cartwright men near the shop that night, financial records showing payments made to spread rumors through town. Enough to bring this in front of the regional magistrate, if it comes to that. Enough to make your family's name mean something very different than it does now. Edmund's jaw tightened. You wouldn't dare drag this into mortal courts. Try me, Mira said, and meant it. Kyle stepped forward then, voice low and final. The oath protects what it protects. Edmund, permanently now, properly claimed by both of us. Every attempt your family makes against either of us going forward will be documented, witnessed, and brought before whatever authority will listen, mortal or otherwise. Your 6 centuries of quiet feuding end here, not because I've decided to be generous, because you've finally run out of leverage. For a long moment, Edmund said nothing, some calculation passing behind his sharp eyes as he weighed his options, and clearly found them wanting. "This isn't over," he said finally, though the words carried less weight than he probably intended. "It is, actually," Kael said. "It just took 600 years, and a seamstress with steadier hands than anyone else who's tried." They left Edmund's estate that night with the document still in hand, insurance against any future attempt at retaliation, though something in Mira's gut told her the Cartwrights understood, finally, that this particular fight was over. "You were terrifying in there," Kael said, once they were walking back through the cold night air. "I was terrified in there," Mira corrected, laughing slightly despite herself, the tension of the last weeks finally starting to unwind. "You didn't look it." "Good," Mira said. That was the point. Spring came slowly that year, the way it always did in the north. But it came. Kael rebuilt the shop, not as charity, he was careful to remind her more than once, but as a joint investment in something they'd both decided mattered: a proper workshop, bigger than the old one, with real light and good tools, and enough space for Mira to eventually take on an apprentice or two, if she wanted. She did want that, it turned out. Word had spread, not just about the fire and the Cartwrights and the strange rumors surrounding Lord Kael's household, but about the seamstress who'd apparently stood her ground against one of the oldest merchant families in the region, and won. Customers came from further away now, curious and respectful in equal measure, and Mira found herself busier than she'd ever been, in a good way this time. She still lived above the shop, mostly, though she spent more nights at the manor than she probably would have admitted to her old customers. Kael never pushed her to move in fully, never treated the oath between them as an obligation rather than a choice, and somehow that made her want to stay closer than any demand ever could have. "You could just live here," he told her one evening, the two of them sitting in the library that had slowly filled with less dust and more warmth over the past several months. "The commute between here and town can't be easy." "I like having my own space," Mira said. "Even now." "I know," Kael said. "I'm not asking you to give that up. I just like the idea of you being closer." Mira smiled slightly, setting down the piece of embroidery she'd been working on, not for a customer this time, just something for herself. Small flowers along a handkerchief edge, the kind of quiet work she hadn't allowed herself time for in years. "Maybe eventually," she said. "Let me finish rebuilding my own life first. Then we'll talk about merging it with yours properly." "That's fair," Kael said, and he sounded like he meant it, no impatience underneath the words. It was a different kind of relationship than anything Mira had imagined for herself, growing up poor and mostly alone, watching other girls dream about husbands and houses, while she focused on keeping her mother's shop from collapsing entirely. She'd never expected to end up bound, quite literally, to an immortal man with 6 centuries of grief behind his eyes. She definitely hadn't expected it to feel this steady, this quietly comfortable, once the danger had finally settled. Eleanor's portrait still hung in the library, and Mira had taken to visiting it sometimes on her own, when Kael wasn't around, talking quietly to a woman who'd died protecting a family that had outlived her by centuries. "I hope this is what you wanted," she told the portrait one evening. "Someone to finish what you started, someone to make sure he wasn't alone with it forever." She didn't expect an answer, obviously, but something about saying it out loud in that quiet library felt important anyway. "She'd have liked you," Kael said from the doorway, having apparently overheard part of it. "She always said the family needed someone practical, someone who wouldn't get swept up in the grandeur of it all and forget what actually mattered." "I'm fairly practical," Mira agreed. "Comes from years of counting every coin twice before spending it. It shows," Kael said, crossing the room to stand beside her, looking up at his sister's portrait with an expression that had softened considerably since the night Mira first saw it. "Thank you for finishing what she started. I don't think I ever properly said that." You don't have to keep thanking me, Mira said. I didn't do it for gratitude. I know, Kael said. That's exactly why I keep wanting to say it anyway. Summer arrived properly by the time the Cartwrights made their final move, not violence this time, but something almost more dangerous, an attempt to challenge the oath's legitimacy through old family law, dragging Kael into a mortal court that hadn't dealt with matters like this in generations. Mira sat beside him through every session, documents in hand, steady in a way that surprised even herself, given how the whole ordeal had started with her simply mending a torn coat for coin she desperately needed. The magistrate, an elderly man who clearly didn't fully believe half of what was being argued in front of him, but recognized real evidence when he saw it, eventually ruled decisively in Kael's favor, citing the documented harassment, the arson, and the clear pattern of intimidation the Cartwrights had employed for months. It's over, Kael said. Once they'd left the courthouse, the summer sun warm on both their faces in a way that felt almost unfamiliar after the long, cold months before. Properly, legally, permanently over. 600 years, Mira said, shaking her head slightly. All ended in a courtroom that took maybe 3 weeks to sort through. Sometimes that's how these things end, Kael said. Not with grand battles, just with someone finally getting tired enough of losing to try something as ordinary as the law. They walked back through town together, and for the first time since that first strange night with the cloak, Mira felt something like peace settle over her properly. Not just the temporary relief of surviving one crisis before the next arrived. What happens now? She asked, as they passed her old shop, rebuilt and busy, a new sign hanging above the door that she'd designed herself. Now, Kael said, stopping in the street, turning to face her properly, I suppose we get to find out what an ordinary life looks like for two people who started this the least ordinary way imaginable. I don't think either of us is very good at ordinary, Mira pointed out. No, Kael agreed, something warm crossing his face that she'd learned to recognize over the past several months. But I'd like to try it with you anyway. He didn't propose that day, not exactly, not with speeches or grand gestures the way she half expected, given everything else about their story. Instead, he simply took her hand, right where the matching marks sat on both their wrists, warm and steady the way they'd been since that night in the library. I know how this usually goes in the stories people tell, he said. Grand declarations. Public spectacle. I've had 600 years to learn I'm not particularly good at any of that. You did all right with Edmund Cartwright, Mira said, smiling slightly. That was different. That was defending you. This is, he paused, searching for words in a way that seemed genuinely difficult for him. This is asking you to stay. Not because the oath requires it. Not because it's safer. Just because I want to spend whatever years you have, and however many I've got left after that, actually living, instead of just enduring. Mira looked at him for a long moment, at the man who'd once seemed so distant and dangerous standing in his study, and who now stood in front of her in the middle of an ordinary summer street, asking for something as simple and enormous as a life together. Yes, she said, before he'd even fully finished the question, because 600 years of patience deserved at least that much certainty in return. I'm staying. They didn't marry in some grand cathedral or announce it to society the way the old stories always seem to demand. Instead, it happened quietly, in the library, in front of Eleanor's portrait, with only Kael's oldest servants as witnesses, and the summer evening light coming warm through the tall windows. Mira wore a dress she'd made herself, simple but carefully stitched. Every seam exactly where it should be. It felt right, somehow, to make it with her own hands, rather than have someone else do it for her, given everything that had brought her here. The structure holds, Kael murmured to her afterward, echoing something she'd once overheard him say to himself, standing in this same library months before, back when she'd still been half convinced this whole strange story would end in disaster, rather than something worth keeping. It holds because we chose it properly, Mira said, leaning into him, the mark on her wrist warm and steady against his skin. Not because a curse demanded it, not because either of us had no other option. We built this on purpose. Together, there was a version of this story, she thought sometimes, where a poor seamstress mended a stranger's coat for coin and never thought about it again. Where the blood on her fingertip meant nothing. Where the mark never appeared. Where Kyle Ashworth remained exactly what the town rumors always said: he was distant, dangerous, untouchable. But that wasn't the story that happened. Instead, an accidental drop of blood had finished something 600 years unfinished, and in doing so, had given two people who'd both spent far too long carrying their burdens alone the chance to finally set some of that weight down. Mira still ran her shop in town, busier now than it had ever been, with two apprentices learning the careful, patient work her mother had once taught her. She still counted every coin twice out of old habit, still preferred mending things with her own hands rather than paying someone else to do it. Some things, it turned out, didn't need an ancient oath to stay exactly as they were, but some evenings, when the shop closed and the light started fading toward dusk, she walked the long road out toward the manor instead of climbing the stairs to her old room above the tailor shop, and Kyle was always waiting, standing near the door the way he had that very first night, as though some part of him still couldn't quite believe she'd keep coming back. "You could stop waiting there like that," she told him once, amused. "I'm not going anywhere." Old habits, Kale admitted. 600 years of watching things fall apart makes it hard to trust something staying whole. "Well," Mira said, taking his hand, feeling the familiar warmth of the mark against her own, "you'll just have to get used to it. I'm very good at mending things, remember, even the ones that take a little longer to trust the repair. And that, more than any grand declaration or ancient bargain, was what finally convinced him, not the oath, not the blood, not 6 centuries of careful waiting, but the simple, steady fact of someone choosing to stay, evening after evening, exactly the way she said she would.